The Littles, Chapter 10. Mrs. Little and Granny Little were still in the living room when the other Littles hurried in. "Lucy," said Mrs. Little, "I thought you were in your room. What happened, Will? Why isn't Lucy with you?" Mr. Little told his wife what had happened. "Lucky for us, Lucy decided to follow me when she did," he said. "I still couldn't believe it. He attacked that huge cat." He shook his head. "It's amazing," said Uncle Pat. "Absolutely amazing." "We were pinned under the logs, Mother," said Tom. "I never got a chance to shoot my bow and arrows." "What are we going to do about that cat?" said Uncle Pat. "Never thought they'd get a cat to chase the mice." "We're safe inside the woods at least," said Mr. Little. "That monster won't be able to get us here." "There's the problem of getting supplies," said Uncle Pat. "We'll have to leave the woods for that." "I think I know how we can get rid of the cat," said Mr. Little. "How?" said all the Littles. "By getting it in trouble," said Mr. Little. "We can pull down the curtains for one thing. The newcomers will blame it on the cat. We can keep spilling its milk. At night, we can make a loud cane noises to keep the newcomers awake. We can even knock over the lamps so they will think the cat did it. Pretty soon, the newcomers will think they have the wrong kind of cat. They will want to get rid of it." Everybody agreed that Mr. Little's plan was a good one. During the next few weeks, the newcomers come to believe their cat was clumsy and noisy. One day, the cat seems to knock over a lamp. Another time, the newcomers were awake half the night listening to meowing. It was really the Littles making a terrible look at. The day after that, the curtains in the dining room were pulled down. "What do we do tomorrow, Dad?" said Tom. "May I spill the cat's milk?" "That's good, yes," said Mr. Little. "It should be done 2 or 3 times in a row, though. Then Mrs. Newcomb will get awfully tired of cleaning it up." "There's only one thing wrong with this plan, Will," said Mrs. Little. "I don't know why you say that," said Mr. Little. "Everything has worked perfectly so far. What's wrong with the plan?" "The cat is still in the house," said Mrs. Little. "Don't worry," said Mr. Little. "It won't be here long." "Mrs. Newcomb must be mad as a wet hen by now," said Uncle Pat. The next day, Tom had a close call. Just as he was lifting the cat's milk dish to spill it for the 3rd time, the cat showed up. The huge animal came bounding toward Tom. At the last moment, Tom upset the milk dish under the cat's nose. That stopped the cat long enough for Tom to get away. "This plan of yours is too slow, Will," said Uncle Pat. "We're going to have to do something else before that cat gets one of us." "What can we do?" said Mr. Little. "We need larger weapons," said Uncle Pat. "I don't know if that's the answer, Uncle Pat," said Mr. Little. "Best that takes time too. You're right, though. This plan isn't working. I heard Mrs. Newcomb telling Mr. Newcomb not to get rid of the cat. She's afraid of mice will return. And she likes cats," Mr. Little went on. "Thinks is a cute. She says it's a high-spirited. Not only that, said Mrs. Little, we can't break up everything in the house just to get rid of the cat. It's the big house, after all. Why don't we try taming the cat? Said Tom. What? Said Uncle Pat. Let's see if we can tame it, repeated Tom. Cats have been friends to men since the early history. Uncle Pat looked from Mrs. Little to Mr. Little. Do you hear what the boy is saying? He said. He's gone soft in the head. No kidding, Dad, said Tom. It's true. The early Egyptians thought cats were gods. They had them all over the place. They did they? Said Uncle Pat. Where did you hear such a nonsense? I read it in one of the big history books, said Tom. Uncle Pat snorted. A cat has never been a friend of a little. I can tell you that. Maybe that's because none of them ever tried to tame a cat, said Tom. They were always afraid of cats. What kind of silly talk is that, little boy? Said Uncle Pat. Look at the size of the beast. Who could tame such a monster? Men tame elephants, said Tom. Tom has an interesting idea, said Mr. Little. Perhaps we'll worry too much about the size of the cat. Because we're so small, we've always thought all large animals were our enemies. Now, maybe that's wrong. I don't like the way this talk is going, said Uncle Pat. It's against everything we littles believe. Making friends with a cat is like making friends with a rattlesnake. Tom is saying it's not the same thing, said Mr. Little. Cats are friendly to men, rattlesnakes are not. None of the littles spoke. Now we may be little, said Mr. Little, but we're men. Of course we are, said Uncle Pat. He looked sideways at the tail. We're not animals. Then why can't we have a cat around the house just like other people? Of all the silly ideas, said Uncle Pat. Oh dear, said Mrs. Little. It sounds all right, but I don't know. Why, it's a wonderful idea, said Granny Little. It's so simple. Simple-minded, said Uncle Pat. Why didn't someone think of it before? Said Granny Little. Because it's a cuckoo idea. That's why, said Uncle Pat. Now see here, Peter Little, said Granny. Mind your manners. She stood up. Her ball of knitting yarn fell from her lap. It rolled between Mr. Little's feet. I've lived a few more days than you have, and I know a few more things than you do too. Mr. Little picked up the ball of yarn. He tossed it gently to the air a few times. We could start taming the cat by giving her a present. Show her we mean to be friendly. Get her something to play with, said Tom. How about that ball of yarn you feathered if fleeting them? Said Granny Little. Don't cats like to play with things like that? As a matter of fact, Granny, they do, said Mr. Little. Will that make her friendly? Said Mrs. Little. It might help, said Mr. Little. We could roll a ball of yarn at the cat and see what happens. All we have to do is make sure we have room to get out of the way if she doesn't get the idea. I am against it, said Uncle Pat. Too dangerous. Cats are cats. You can't change them. There's a large ball of yarn in the Mrs. Biggs sewing basket, said Lucy. I lifted it once. It's lighter than anything. Let's get it, said Mr. Little. I think it's worth trying. He looked at the Uncle Pat. That's it. If no one else has any better ideas. Count me out, said Uncle Pat. I will stay here and sharpen my sword.